Well, thank you so much to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to participate. My name is Lauren Sankary. I am the Associate Director of the Neuroethics program at the Cleveland Clinic, and just finished up a fellowship funded by the NIH BRAIN Initiative, focused on ethical challenges in early phase brain device research, and particularly some of the ethical challenges that arise at the end of clinical trials of implanted devices, such as deep brain stimulation. So I'm excited to present some of the findings from my research that was funded by the BRAIN Initiative to you today. And my objectives with this presentation are to describe first some of those ethical challenges that arise in early phase brain device research, as well as some of the practical and ethical issues that arise when attempting to obtain initial and ongoing consent in these early phase clinical trials, and then to reflect on the role of ethics to help support brain device research and make sure that we're upholding the best possible practices in this area of clinical research. So to give an overview first of just where ethical challenges might arise in early phase clinical research, there's certainly challenges that come up before you get to the point of conducting a first-in-human study. And those are outside of the scope of my presentation today. But I will discuss some of the implications of the ethical issues I've explored at the end of this presentation. The first area that ethical challenges might arise once you're involving human subjects in clinical research involving brain devices is during recruitment. And so we'll discuss some of the challenges that might arise just in identifying the right patient population to enroll in clinical studies. And then we'll move on to that initial consent process once you've identified a good candidate to participate in brain device research. Obtaining consent as they initially enroll in a clinical trial can be complicated by some important ethical issues. And then once a research participant has decided to enroll in a clinical trial, there are ethical challenges that arise related to ongoing consent and making sure that participants continue to be involved in research in a voluntary and informed way. Then we'll explore exit from clinical research, which was the focus of my empirical neuroethics research. And it's an area that I've done quite a bit of research in terms of what regulations apply at the end of a clinical trial once participants are about to exit from a clinical trial. And then finally, we'll discuss some complex challenges that come up related to post-trial access to brain devices and important decisions that are made about whether to provide access to research participants to these devices once they're no longer enrolled in a clinical protocol, a clinical trial protocol. So to start with challenges during recruitment of research participants, two important ethical issues to pay attention to are first the vulnerability of potential research subjects. So eligibility to participate in a brain device trial is often limited to individuals who have treatment refractory and chronic disorders. Brain devices generally are not explored as first-line therapeutic modalities. And so usually in order for an individual to be eligible to participate in this kind of research, they've experienced a great deal of time with a neurological disorder, and they have probably tried numerous medical therapies and other treatment modalities before considering enrollment in a clinical trial. And so this raises concerns about potential vulnerability, about a sense of desperation that individuals might have if they don't feel like there are that there are treatment options or maybe other research trials that they could consider enrolling in. So it's important to be attentive to how to safeguard against concerns about undue influence or coercion in just identifying who might be a good candidate to recruit for a clinical trial of an investigational brain device. And the second concern is establishing appropriate inclusion and exclusion criteria, and more importantly, as you're attempting to recruit participants, avoiding bias when attempting to make sure that potential participants have motivations that are consistent with being a part of clinical research, and anticipating whether you've identified an individual who's likely to adhere to a treatment protocol. Once you're actually at the point of obtaining initial consent to be a part of clinical research, this consent process can be complicated first by therapeutic misconception, or a misunderstanding of just the fact that that the way in which this individual is going to get a brain device, that's taking place as part of a research protocol. It can often appear as though you're going to, let's say, an academic medical center, and it might appear as though that research participant is just undergoing a standard clinical therapy, particularly with implanted devices, where enrolling in research might involve undergoing an invasive surgery, for instance. Individuals who consider enrolling in research might not be fully clear that they're enrolling in a research protocol and not just undergoing a cutting-edge therapeutic intervention. There are also concerns that participants might have about just the invasiveness of brain implants. And you might think of invasiveness as just concerns about something going under the skin, a device being implanted. But if it's not a brain implant, there might also be concerns about privacy and whether, if the device particularly is recording neural data, whether that's invasive of subjects' privacy in a different way. And so that might deter potential participants from enrolling in brain device research studies. And third, just the medical and technological complexity of brain devices can pose barriers to a fully informed consent process, particularly if health literacy might prevent a patient from fully understanding the device itself and how that device is expected to interplay with a neurological disease process. Once a subject has actually decided to enroll in a clinical study, there are challenges with ongoing consent, and these can be caused by just the impact of the brain device itself on cognitive or affective components of decision-making capacity. So even if a subject has decision-making capacity when they enroll in a clinical trial, if the device itself may impact decision-making over the course of a study, you might worry that there are fluctuations in decision-making capacity that can impact ongoing informed consent. With brain implants, there are risks involved in the surgical removal of a brain device, and making sure that a participant's ongoing participation in a study continues to be voluntary and informed means that participants need to understand the risks of surgical removal, and those are separate from the initial risks of implantation, those risks that a subject might have been thinking much more about when they initially enrolled in a clinical trial. There are risks of continued use in implantation, and sometimes these are unknown or unforeseen risks that longer-term stimulation may have. Even if animal studies have given the research team a good sense of what the short-term effects of stimulation are, it can be hard to predict what those longer-term effects of stimulation when we're discussing devices, neuromodulation devices that use electrical stimulation. And then finally, there are burdens related to follow-up care with these devices. So it's burdens that may accrue to a participant as they're in a clinical trial, but also as they think about exiting from a clinical trial. There might be concerns about how to get access to that follow-up care, particularly if that research subject doesn't want to stay in a research study. So if the clinical trial is the only way that a subject can access that follow-up care, that might create some ethical concerns about coercion, essentially, or some undue influence to stay in a research study. So I think these ethical challenges create important obligations, and regulation, FDA regulation that applies to most brain device studies, focus on minimizing coercion and protecting subject rights, safety, and welfare. So investigators need to be attentive to issues related to ongoing consent and preserving a subject's right to decline surgical explant of devices, or their right to exit a study if their circumstances change and they no longer wish to participate in research. it's important to plan for how to protect that right to exit from a research study. And then there are ongoing obligations that an investigator has related to the control and supervision of device use. And so even if a subject wishes to exit from a clinical trial, there's still obligations that a researcher might have to report adverse events. And so that's an ongoing obligation they might have. And I think there's still a question about exactly when these obligations and responsibilities end. Because even in the context of post-trial access to devices, which we'll talk about soon, some of these obligations to report adverse events are issues that arise related to brain devices if subjects continue to use them after a clinical trial. In some contexts, it's clear that the responsibilities investigators have related to supervision of device use don't end exactly when the clinical trial ends. At the point that subjects are exiting from research, there are important financial burdens to consider. And I found in some of my qualitative research where I interviewed subjects who either were exiting from a clinical trial or had exited from a clinical trial of a brain device within the last 5 to 10 years. Many of the subjects told me that they didn't really think through many of the financial burdens that might accrue to them if they decided to continue to use this investigational brain device after the clinical trial ended. So particularly battery replacements that may be required if a subject is experiencing benefit and wishes to continue to experience this benefit. And those battery replacements can be costly, and it sometimes isn't fully clear to clinical trial participants whether the sponsor or the researchers will continue to pay for those device replacements or to pay for the follow-up care that they'll need to continue to receive. And I think as somebody continues to be in a research study, we need to be attentive to whether those financial burdens create a barrier to withdrawal from research and might influence potential participants to stay in a research study, even if there's something that's changed in terms of their motivations or their life circumstances that might make them wish to withdraw from research. And finally, when we think about exit from research, there's a separate informed consent process that needs to take place in brain implant research related to the surgical removal of a device. So there are additional risks related to the surgery itself to remove the device. In the context of deep brain stimulation, researchers found that the risks of removing implanted electrodes are actually higher. Usually the risk of a bleed is actually higher upon removing electrodes than even when they were initially placed. And so research participants have described to me that generally they were taking things one step at a time, and as they were initially enrolling in research, hadn't really thought through those additional risks that might accrue to them at the point that the device might be surgically removed. And so important trade-offs come up at the end of a research study. There are ongoing risks if subjects decide to keep a device implanted, but there are also risks to having the device removed. And sometimes that risk-benefit analysis really needs to take place on an individual basis. If a research subject, for instance, has had a change in their health status over the course of participation in a research study, then there might need to be a really individualized analysis for whether it's ethically and medically appropriate to remove that brain device, especially if that subject might be experiencing benefit from the device and if the risks have changed since they initially enrolled in research. So when we think about research oversight, while IRB approval might depend on minimizing risks to subjects, and that may in some ways push for avoiding unnecessary risks, either related to explant of a device or continued use of a device, if there are ongoing risks of infection, let's say with a brain implant. It's important to note that there might be a gap in research oversight once the end of the trial has taken place, because IRB might have limited post-trial oversight once a research study ends. Another concern that I've come across in terms of the thought I put into exit from research protocols is that there seems to be significant variability from one clinical trial to another in terms of what procedures there are for exit from a clinical study. So there doesn't seem to be a very standard or consistent approach to just explaining what options research participants have at the end of a clinical trial or the consent process that might take place. And also the analysis of the risks and benefits of surgical removal of these investigational devices. So these inconsistent practices raise ethical concerns related to justice. And I think it's important that researchers share the practices that they use or the options that they provide related to surgical removal or post-trial use of implanted devices, in part to address these justice concerns. We don't want different benefits to accrue to some research participants, where others might feel the sense that they're forced to have a device that's benefiting them removed just by virtue of variation in clinical trial design. And an unanswered question at this point comes up related to post-trial access and requirements for post-trial access. We still have not clarified whether there's truly an obligation to allow participants to continue to use brain implants if they're benefiting from that investigational implant once they're exiting from a research study. And post-trial access has been discussed quite a bit. Initially, it was a topic that received some ethical interest during HIV clinical trials of therapies in the treatment of HIV. And when we think about brain devices, it's FDA regulation that would generally apply. That would be the regulatory constraints for offering post-trial access to brain devices. And so continued access to brain devices is not FDA required, but it is permitted under expanded access provisions. I mean, this usually requires some preliminary evidence that the device is safe and effective. And it does create these ongoing obligations that I mentioned before for safety monitoring and adverse event reporting. And so if an investigator decides that they are going to make sure that participants in their clinical trial have access to the investigational device after the trial is ended, that creates some ongoing responsibilities for that investigator to monitor whether there are any adverse events even after the clinical trial has ended. So there are multiple stakeholders when you discuss post-trial access to brain devices, and that includes participants in these clinical trials, the clinical researchers themselves who may accrue additional obligations if they decide to offer post-trial access. The study sponsor may have an important stake in whether post-trial access is offered, because this may really change the costs of sponsoring research. The FDA and other regulatory bodies clearly have some stake in this, since it may change the amount of regulatory oversight that needs to be provided. Research oversight bodies such as IRB may have limited jurisdiction when it comes to post-trial access or post-trial device use. But they may have a stake or they may have a role at least in examining whether there's a good enough plan for what happens to investigational brain implants after a clinical trial ends. Healthcare insurers may have a stake in that if a research study doesn't pay for follow-up care, that follow-up care for research participants may accrue to healthcare insurers instead. And I would say the public also has a stake in these questions about post-trial access. There may be concerns that people who participate in research may have preferential access to brain devices, but also the public might have an interest in encouraging people to participate in research to contribute to generalizable knowledge about health conditions. So the public may actually have an interest in offering post-trial access to the extent that it may be fair, but also it may incentivize research participation. So two scenarios are important to think about when we consider the ethical issues in post-trial access. The first would be somebody who benefits from a brain implant in a clinical trial that's overall unsuccessful. So it's likely that that brain device, because the clinical trial was not successful, that brain device might not go to market. And so the costs and burdens of device maintenance may be difficult to justify for a sponsor, but the benefit that an individual who experienced the risks or underwent the risks of participating in this research trial is an important countervailing consideration. And finally, a second scenario would be a non-responder in an otherwise successful clinical trial. And so that non-responder may, if the device were to continue to be turned on, there's a possibility that non-responder will eventually become a responder, but may just have a delayed response. And so this brings up questions about clinical trial design and clinical endpoints that are chosen in designing these clinical trials. But also this non-responder may be concerned about the risks of device removal if it seems like removing the device is the best balance of risks and benefits for that participant. And it's also important to consider the psychological impact. It can be incredibly devastating for research participants who have exposed themselves to significant risks and invested quite a bit of time and hope in their participation in a clinical trial. And it can be devastating to feel like even the last resort, even this experimental treatment that they tried when no FDA-approved treatments could help them have failed. And when we think about some of the trade-offs in offering post-trial access, there are people who argue that post-trial access should be mandated in some sense because it's really impossible in an informed consent process to help a research participant understand what it might be like to have access to a therapy that benefits them, and then to lose that access merely because a clinical trial has ended. There's some people who say that the post-trial access is consistent with some of the entrustment or the duties of care that investigators assume as they engage in relationships, investigator-subject relationships with study participants. And there are also concerns about just whether reciprocity or concerns to avoid exploitation really create an obligation to provide post-trial access. But on the other hand, Richard Saver describes that opposition to continued access to investigational technologies might be based on concerns about impeding research progress. That it may, if you create indefinite obligation for researchers to provide continued access to these investigational therapies, that might disincentivize research. It may, in fact, incentivize participants to withdraw early from a research study. There are concerns about preferential access, and also whether, in fact, providing post-trial access to investigational therapies could exacerbate therapeutic misconception. Could really exacerbate misunderstandings people have about the nature of research as opposed to clinical care. The Declaration of Helsinki provides a little bit of guidance about post-trial access. It encourages provision of post-trial access to any intervention that's identified as beneficial in the trial, although it doesn't provide all that much clarity about what is considered benefit. Whether a study has to show efficacy on a cohort basis or just in an individual assessment of whether an individual research participant is experiencing benefit. The Neuroethics Roadmap that was recently published by the NIH BRAIN Initiative provides some additional guidance on both post-trial access and some of the earlier ethical issues I described when we think about recruitment and informed consent, as well as exit from research. So the BRAIN Initiative, the Neuroethics Roadmap published by the BRAIN Initiative describes that we need to be attentive to informed consent processes. We need to outline in detail the potential end of trial and post-trial responsibilities that investigators have to research participants. And really get over IRB oversight of these plans. They are particularly attentive to the idea that we need to pay attention to whether participants benefit from study participation and how that benefit will be managed in plans for the end of a clinical trial. Additionally, they describe that it's important when a non-clinical scientist is designing or conducting a human subjects trial, that there are clinicians included on the research team who are sensitive to some of the clinical concerns and clinical considerations that arise in conducting clinical research. They also describe that it's important to anticipate in advance potential psychosocial risks to research participants. So that might include concerns about changes in self-identity or personality changes, but also would include what I mentioned about some of the psychological risks of attempting of participating in clinical research, hoping to experience benefit when a participant has tried many other therapies that have not provided benefit. And finally, the Neuroethics Roadmap encourages researchers to use real-world samples to include participants who have coexisting or comorbid conditions in order to make sure that research results in generalizable findings. And these are good ethical practices as well as just good research practices. The Neuroethics Roadmap specifically describes some post-study responsibilities researchers should be attentive to, such as developing detailed protocols about how they will handle post-study follow-up, and paying attention to the often overlooked physical and psychological risks that even a successful intervention may pose to research participants. I described briefly some of my own neuroethics research, and I was specifically exploring some of these questions about what researchers owe research participants at the end of clinical trials of implanted brain devices. And I think it can be incredibly helpful to integrate neuroethics research into ongoing clinical research. One can simply get advice from an ethicist as they're designing clinical trials, especially in early phase research. One could collaborate with an ethicist to explore some unique ethical issues. So having an ethics sub-study or an ethics aim to an ongoing clinical research proposal can help you to explore the ethical concerns that might not be immediately evident when considering designing an early phase clinical trial. And one can also conduct parallel empirical ethics studies to make sure that we are working closely together to understand some of the ethical implications of early phase clinical research. And I think I'll describe just a couple of ways that some of the empirical neuroethics research that's been funded by the BRAIN Initiative and other areas of NIH, other institutes within NIH, which I think this research can help us understand multiple stakeholder perspectives in ways that might not be completely apparent when overseeing research. Empirical neuroethics research can also help us understand some overlooked ethical concerns, as well as provide some insight into just the impact of research safeguards that are already in place. And an important unanswered question that I'll end with is, I think I focused on some ethical issues that arise once we're actually implanting brain devices into humans. I think it's important to also think about how these findings can inform researchers when they're earlier along this translational research process. So how can the work that we've done in neuroethics inform just decisions about whether to translate from a preclinical study to a first-in-human study? So to me, this is the next question about how to make sure that ethics research and findings from the ethics research that's being conducted can actually support researchers early along in the process when these findings can be most impactful down the road in translational research. And so I will stop there. I hope to receive some questions from anyone who has questions after seeing this presentation, and thank you for your attention.